Professor Dressler, it's an honor to meet you. And I thank you very much for this opportunity to be able to speak with you and to learn a lot in the process. So thank you kindly. So maybe we'll just start just by talking a little bit about yourself and your work. We're talking about the contributions in the field and the development of the field, but of course, you're a major contributor in the field. So we'll start with you. Can you kind of take us through a short journey of your career from the time you started until now in terms of your major accomplishments and you know, the developments?
I was always impressed by scholars who were shifting their focus during their lifetime. And so I did it myself. So I started as an Indo-Europeanist working on the history of Indo-European languages, on the comparison of Indo-European languages and the reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European. Certain things have been appreciated of what I did. So as an early researcher, it was important for me that I detected a new sound law, although in a very exotic and marginal ancient Greek dialect, and other things where, yeah, to a certain extent, I innovated. But when and that was in Vienna and in a study in Rome, and I was then around, yeah, it was in the year 60. Of my university then, one of the few who had external experience studying also in a different country. Whereas now this is very general and I think still very desirable and should still be expanded to have these foreign experiences. But then when I was invited to UCLA in Los Angeles to teach there, I much deepened my interest and knowledge in theoretical general linguistics. And UCLA was one of the hotbeds of generative grammar, of course. But then, for example, I found out that certain subjects are too complex to be studied only as part of one's research, and that was syntax. So I stopped to work on syntax, for example. And I think it is important for young researchers to see at a certain point where they really can have a hope of having success in specializing and being able to keep in updated research. Yeah, and then I was offered an associate professorship at Ohio State University in Columbus, which was also an excellent department of linguistics. And there I was especially impressed by natural phonology, then just started by David Stamp, who is now emeritus at the University of Hawaii. And this influenced me a lot, and I expanded it later when coming back to the University of Vienna, where I was offered the first chair existing on general and applied linguistics. But for me, it was, of course, mostly general linguistics. I developed my own brand of natural phonology, and with two others, expanded the general approach to morphology. We called it natural morphology. And then I used it also after having come into an entirely different subject, which was text and discourse linguistics. And where I was one of the first text linguistics in Europe, text linguists in Europe. I expanded it later on also to develop a natural approach to text linguistics, where natural means, um, in a nutshell, that one derives from general semiotic, cognitive, and for phonology also from phonetic principles, preferences for the respective field, phonology, morphology, and in my case also text linguistics. Yeah, and well, this led me clearly to comparing different components of language, which I find is also important. And it has been also important in other approaches, for example, to compare syntax with phonology, which is mostly done, etc. Yeah, well, what are other new things? One thing that I started to do with my first third-party research money, which was American, was to study in Bretagne, this westernmost province of France, Breton language, for the Celtic language Breton, for new things that had never been studied for it, like in phonology and so on, and did one of the first articles and conferences on language death, studying how, with many people, the minority languages of Breton was dying or before decaying. And the first conference I did was at the regional meeting of the Chicago Linguistic Society, and had a rather great resonance. But later on, I stopped to work on that, and other people, both American and European, became the protagonists of this field, although I'm still interested in it. Next, like other linguists, I became interested in aphasia because I hoped that in looking at disturbances of language, one may understand also healthy language, so to say, better. As Roger Bacon has said, one can understand the machine only if one knows how it breaks down and so on. Yeah, and for about 20 years, I worked also on aphasic disturbances, especially of phonology and morphology. Yeah, but then I changed from aphasia study to first language acquisition studies, which had several motives. One, because I got fed up with the anecdotal evidence that linguists liked and sometimes still like to cite from sight language. One heard two children saying something and then generalized to something which would be typical for child language, no? And so I started a big comparative project, which is still going on, and which deals with first language acquisition in between a dozen and 20 languages according to the foreign contributors and their interest to work on specific topics. And this is one of the major topics I'm dealing with still now. And here it is, of course, very important to have research associates, and this is basically for me. And then what came in still later is that I was appointed at the end of my university career as temporary head of a corpus linguistic and digital humanities unit of the Austrian Academy of Sciences. And when I stepped down, I remained the deputy director, but the director then had to quit because of health problems, and so I was again. And this led me to work, of course, with research associated there on huge electronic data, especially involving morphology. And so I would say that nowadays I'm mostly involved still with morphology and with corpus linguistic and acquisitionist analysis of morphology. And this has to do with my two functions, one in the academy and the other we have still a project going on in the university. And that there are young researchers which work with me. And this goes well with my main moral objective of research now, which is to be helpful for young researchers in making their career, and the best measure I can do is to co-publish with them.
Oh, wonderful.
Well, that would be. And maybe one thing is then one should not forget about the fields one has left, even if the knowledge becomes outdated.
Mm-hmm.
Because it can be useful even later on for understanding language better and for using it in one's work.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I want to go back to a point that you made at the beginning, which I found particularly fascinating. When you started your research and your investigations, you started with Indo-Europeans. When we look at the languages of the past, in order to understand and build upon the languages of the present, what are some of the lessons? What are some of the ways that you can gain insight into current languages from studying languages in the past, like you did when you first started?
So I think one aspect of studying current languages, which is often underrated, is the productivity of processes. Mm-hmm. What is in many approaches called rules. So is a rule productive, or is it only semi-productive, or is it unproductive? And then in order to explain why certain rules are only semi-productive or unproductive, one has to go into diachrony. So this is one important thing. The other thing is that one observes diachronic change in progress. And it's very useful to relate that to well-studied similar processes that occurred in the past. Yeah? And this is especially important also in another field where I forgot that I worked in, and this is the social linguistic analysis of processes. So, for example, we did a lot on social linguistic processes in phonology and phonetics, and now also for acquisition, where one of our foci, is that the correct pronunciation, is the differences in language acquisition of people, of children of high and versus low socioeconomic status. And this is important because it's so much easier to work with high socioeconomic status families that usually language acquisition studies are done just with these children. Right. And one forgets that there's a big difference in acquisition.
Mhm.
And this, we think, is also a great ethical question for linguistics, and where linguists can hope to work. And it's also a very disturbing aspect of language acquisition, because there is some evidence that disadvantages
Mhm.
in language acquisition
Yeah.
of low socioeconomic status children are lasting,
Yes.
and that despite of our belief in the equality of people, um, also to what Edward Sapir said, that we linguists are interested both in the language of Shakespeare, and I think he said something like swineherds of Assam. Yeah, there are differences, and for somebody who thinks in inequality, this is a very disturbing issue.
Mhm. What impacts has language researcher had on people's lives?
On people's lives so far? Well, language education has, of course, been changed quite a lot. No, um, um, also to, of course, psychological and pedagogical developments. Um, but sometimes this may be overdone. So the one thing where I'm quite skeptical is something which many linguists like today, and this is importance of frequency. Frequency of certain constructions or certain words, etc. This is sometimes overrated, because we found out that familiarity with something is more important than frequency, which means that better methods must be developed for rating familiarity. They are already, but they are not done often enough. So yeah, this would be another another aspect where it happens that in the course of linguistics there is going back and forth. No.
Now, where do you think research on language should be heading?
Well, I think all of the trends that have appeared in linguistics since the 19th century merit to be pursued, unless deviations which were due to nationalist or even chauvinistic or racist ideologies and similar things, or to totalitarian influences like Marism in Stalinist Soviet Union or something like that. But all deserve being developed, and they should learn from each other and see their limitations. And I must say, the older I get, the more I discover the sea of ignorance in which we navigate with great difficulty, and where we can just develop small islands like the actually the Chinese politicians who are making small islands of rifts in the in the Chinese Sea. So not more. The ignorance is like the Chinese seas, and what we know is like these small rifts, which are a bit expanded by the Chinese military. And it is a sort of battle. Therefore, this comparison with the Chinese military is not totally crazy, I think. So it is necessary to learn from other methodologies and approaches. This is very important.
Yes.
And to be, and it's important for students, that they get large views and are exposed to many different subjects in their study because they finally specialize. And also, if this is possible, it is a very enriching experience to change one's focus, so to say. And else to prophesize which fields are more promising for future research and for changes in research. This is very, very hard to predict. I've been several times quite surprised. Yeah. And of course, one thing which is good is that due to the internet, it's much more easy to get information.
Yes.
Although there's much too much information to to control, but to try not to reinvent the wheel, but to see what has been done already. Because very often old ideas may have a new chance.
Right. Actually, and continuing along that line, are there other pieces of advice that you can give students and junior colleagues?
Yeah, to get confronted with other approaches and to see whether one can find something useful there. And it might be also useful if you detect that something is totally contrary to what you want to do, because then you can sharpen your own position. Because often you sharpen your positions not only in a positive way, but also in a negative way. So to become exposed to other, and therefore participation in international conferences is a very important thing to do. And this is currently done by so many young people. And it's quite good that this starts earlier, so that there are, for example, conferences which concentrate on young people to give talks and to discuss and so on.
Okay. One final thought. Do you think it's an advantage for students to be polyglots like yourself and know about many different languages?
Well, I found that there are important or maybe not that famous, but still very valid linguists who may be gifted for foreign language learning, or which are less gifted. And I don't find great difference, but one should try to learn several languages to a certain degree. It is both good to know some foreign languages well, and to know even more structurally, but practically at a very elementary level. Because I found it so easy to forget practical use of foreign languages. That happened to me for many languages.
Any other thoughts or analysis about the major accomplishments in the field of research, things that maybe we could have done better in the past, and directions we should be heading in? Any final kind of thoughts or analysis on these?
Well, in many other disciplines, one has spoken of the linguistic turn, which came also inspired by Noam Chomsky, but also of others. And there has been excessive hopes on what linguistics can be doing in that time. I find it still rather puzzling when some work on ancient Greek phonology has been financed by the American Atomic Commission, because they thought that this might be somehow useful for linguistic description and for helping to translate Russian into English automatically. Yeah. So and of course, many linguists were glad to receive such money. But this led inevitably to an end of the linguistic turn. So I think it's important not to arouse excessive expectations. This is maybe one other point I would like to make. And be realistic, yeah. And modest, and also modest. This is very important. Not to think that one's own views are the only correct ones or the most important ones, whatever. So,
Okay, so I'd like to thank you very much, Professor Dressler, for your comments and your perspectives. We really appreciate hearing what you had to say, and we appreciated you taking the time out to talk to us. So thank you so much.
thank you.